everyone, good evening, and welcome to this, the 8th lecture in the St. Martin in the Fields Autumn Lecture Series. It's wonderful to have all of you join us, both in the building and those of you who are joining us online. You are all most welcome as we explore together the topic of death and dying. I've got a few housekeeping announcements, as always, before we begin. In this lecture, there will be an opportunity to ask some questions towards the end. If you are watching on site in our building and would like to ask a question, we've got a standing mic in the central aisle in the middle of the church. Please do line up behind that microphone when you're invited to do so, which will be after we've heard from all three of our speakers tonight. Please do try to keep your questions brief. One sentence is fantastic to make sure that we can hear from as many people as possible. I know it's difficult, but do try to restrain yourselves. And it'll be great to get as wide a variety of questions tonight as we possibly can. If you are watching online and you would like to ask a question, you can do that by emailing jolly.gosnold@smitf.org, and that email address should be coming up on your screens now. After the lecture, which ends at around 8:30, we would love to invite all of you to join us for a drinks reception downstairs in the crypt foyer. And at that reception, there'll be an opportunity to buy books from our speakers, both from this lecture and from speakers throughout our lecture series so far. So, we've got three really exciting and engaging panelists who are going to be speaking for us this evening. But before they do so, I'd like to offer a few brief words of introduction to our topic for tonight, death and dying. Before pursuing a vocation to become a member of the clergy, I trained and worked as a junior doctor. Now, perhaps medicine, when you hear the word medicine, it makes you think of curative treatment. Maybe it makes you think of people who, they get sick, but then they recover and they can be restored to full health thanks to the power of modern medicine. For some of the patients that I met in my life working as a doctor, that was very much the case. But working in hospitals all too often felt more like managing chronic disease than curing people once and for all. For many of the patients that I saw, our aim as a team was simply to get them well enough to go home with a reasonable quality of life. Working in hospitals also brought me face to face with death. It gave me this strange familiarity with death that I hadn't known before. Buried amongst the busyness of life on the wards, the admissions, the discharges, the ward rounds, the ward jobs, and so much else besides, was also the privilege of being with people during the final hours or days of their life. I witnessed many deaths which were fully expected and which had been carefully prepared for, people who died with their family around their bedside and their symptoms well controlled. I also witnessed many deaths which were unexpected in some way, people who died while waiting for a routine operation, or people who'd experienced sudden and fatal trauma. But there was a third type of death which was all too common, deaths where expectation was denied. I saw many patients whose dying seemed to roll on inevitably, despite the efforts of teams of healthcare professionals who were desperately trying to save their life. This kind of dynamic wasn't universal. Many of my colleagues seemed to have this single-minded focus on defeating dying through the power of medicine, whereas others concentrated much more on giving the dying process space to run its natural course. But I found myself wondering, as a junior doctor, where was the elusive dividing line between the two? When did dying transform from being something to fight into something to embrace? Despite death being present seemingly everywhere in hospital, it wasn't talked about very much. But although it went unacknowledged, it had a profound impact, not only on patients and loved ones, but on the people looking after them. As healthcare staff, we dealt with dying and death on a daily basis. But the unspoken assumption was often that we were in this place of detached objectivity compared to our patients. I think that maybe a certain amount of detachment was needed, but in the relentless cycle of busyness of medical work, it seemed really difficult to create space to step out of that detachment and to reflect honestly on the deaths that surrounded us. The exception to this for me was palliative care. I never did a palliative care rotation. I never had that privilege, but I did work alongside many palliative care doctors. Their input into the care of a patient often helped me to take a step back from treatments, from test results, and see a more holistic picture, a more whole picture of the person lying in a hospital bed in front of me. I think that the perspective they brought often helped to bring hidden things to the surface. It was a kind of uncovering or a revealing of the whole person in front of us. And from that revelation came, I think, a kind of wisdom, a wisdom which flourished between the doctor, the patient, the loved ones, the others who cared for that person. Wisdom not only about what it is to die, but about what it is to live. And so, with that being a brief description of my own context, my own perspective, I'm very much looking forward to our panel conversation tonight. Without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker for today. Professor Katherine Sleeman is the Lang Galaska Chair in Palliative Care based at the Cicely Saunders Institute at King's College London. And she's an honorary consultant in palliative medicine at King's College Hospital NHS Trust. Katherine leads a program of research on improving care for people nearing the end of their life. She leads the Marie Curie Better End of Life program, a 3-year collaboration that aims to improve care for people affected by dying, death, and bereavement across the UK, with a focus on policy impact. From January next year, she'll be the director of the new NIHR Policy Research Unit for Palliative and End-of-Life Care, which will support policymakers to improve care and reduce inequalities for people affected by life-limiting illnesses and their families and carers. So Katherine brings a wealth of medical experience tonight, and it's a privilege to have her speak for us today. Let's welcome her together.
Bear with me. Thank you. Thank you, Angela, for that introduction and really for inviting me to be part of this autumn lecture series, whose theme is Here I Stand. So here I stand, except quite obviously I don't stand. I'm sitting because of an inconveniently broken ankle. As Angela said, I'm a doctor in palliative medicine and I'm an academic, and I work at the Cicely Saunders Institute, which is part of King's College London. Cicely Saunders was a true visionary. She transformed how we care for the dying. So the story goes that Cicely was working in a hospital in London, actually St Thomas's, just over the river, in the 1950s, when she made an observation that was both simple and profound, and it was this: that doctors desert the dying. As soon as it becomes clear that a person is dying, the doctors, they look the other way. Now, this observation proved pivotal not only for Cicely herself, but in many ways for all of society, because it led to Dame Cicely, founding the first modern hospice, St. Christopher's in Sydenham, and the rest of the hospice movement, and indeed the specialty of palliative medicine, followed from there. What I think is perhaps interesting is that if Cicely Saunders had been born, let's say 100 years earlier, I'm not sure that she would have observed doctors deserting the dying. In fact, I think it's fair to say that during the 19th century, doctors had so little with which to do their doctoring that much of what they did was palliate, tend to the dying. But during the 20th century, there were rapid social, economic, and scientific advances, and we very quickly became good at something we had never been good at before within medicine, and that was saving lives. Progress in terms of life-saving was astonishing. The average human lifespan essentially doubled over the course of just a century. The trouble is, so good have we become at life-saving, so reliant on the increasing sophistication of medical science in pretty much everything we do, that it seems we have forgotten that in every life there will come a point where it is unsavable. Now, while scientific progress hasn't made death any less inevitable, it has changed how we die quite dramatically. Because 150 years ago, most people died suddenly. They died without warning. Nowadays, a sudden death is actually quite unusual. Most of us in the 21st century will live with and die from chronic medical conditions, so things like heart failure, Parkinson's disease, dementia. And our final weeks, months, and years will be characterized by a slowly progressive deterioration in function. So dying older means dying slower, and it also means dying with greater complexity as we live long enough to accumulate multiple medical problems. So where does palliative care fit in? Palliative care is a philosophy of care for people living with life-limiting illnesses, where the focus is on improving the quality of that person's life rather than trying to extend the quantity or the amount of time that they have left to live. Palliative care puts the person and their family before the illness or the pathology. My goal as a palliative care doctor is to work with my wider colleagues to alleviate not only physical suffering, so things like pain or breathlessness, but also social, psychological, and spiritual suffering that people approaching the end of life may be experiencing. Now, I've said that Cicely Saunders was visionary. Where I think she was perhaps most visionary was that she understood right from the start that if we really want to transform care of the dying, it's not enough to build hospices. It's not even enough to provide hands-on clinical care. For true transformation, we have to have research and evidence. We have to understand what works and what doesn't. And we now, not least through research carried out at the Cicely Saunders Institute, have strong evidence that palliative care works. Palliative care improves people's physical symptoms, so their pain, their breathlessness, as well as their psychological symptoms, for example, alleviating depression. People who receive palliative care are less likely to go in and out of hospital in their last months of life. They're more likely to die at home or in a place of their choosing. Palliative care doesn't just improve outcomes for the patient, it improves outcomes for their carers too. The carers of people who receive palliative care experience less complex bereavement experiences. Now, where the evidence gets really interesting is that what several studies have now shown is that people who receive palliative care actually live a bit longer than those who don't. So this is quite paradoxical in a way, because many of my patients sort of make the assumption that, okay, I can understand that palliative care might help me feel a bit better, but surely it will make me die a bit quicker. People assume that palliative care will be associated with a shortening of life, and that is not what these studies have shown. It's important not because palliative care aims to extend people's survival, but so that we can reassure our patients that by saying yes to palliative care, that won't shorten their life. If anything, it may even extend it a little bit. What these studies have also shown, which I think is really important, is that palliative care works best when it's provided early, alongside the care provided by other specialists. So you can think of it quite simply as an extra layer of support. Gone are the days when palliative care was kind of the bit that happened after all the medicine has finished. We're not talking about curative care and then palliative care. It's not one and then the other. It's not either or. It's both together. That is when palliative care works best. And there's a final piece of evidence that I want to tell you about, which is particularly important from a policy point of view. Palliative care is what health economists would call a high-value intervention. It delivers better care and does that at lower overall costs. So it's not only better for patients and carers who have better outcomes, but it's also better for the wider system because palliative care plus standard care costs less than standard care alone. So the evidence on palliative care is actually really clear. We know how to improve outcomes for individuals who are dying and, bonus, at the same time reduce pressure on the acute system. Palliative care works. But there is a problem. Hospice UK estimate that every year in the United Kingdom, 100,000 people die needing palliative care but not receiving it. That's 300 people every single day. We know that like many good things, palliative care isn't distributed equally in society. You're more likely to get palliative care if you're richer, more educated, if you're white, and if you're younger. Our research has shown that some inequalities are getting bigger over time, not smaller. We know that the number of people who need palliative care and will need it in the future is going up quickly because of demographic changes, essentially because of aging. By 2040, there will be an additional 100,000 people in our society who need palliative care. So unless something dramatic happens, what that means is that the gap between those who need palliative care and those who get it isn't just going to get bigger, it's going to double. Last year, there was an historic amendment to legislation to the Health and Social Care Bill, which means that all integrated care boards, their local areas in charge of providing health and care, they must all provide palliative care. But no additional funding was provided with which to do that, and we know through our research that very few integrated care boards have palliative care as a priority area. A study several years ago, when CCGs, or clinical commissioning groups, were the thing, found that the amount that CCGs spend on palliative care varied from £50 per patient per year to over 2,000. That's a 40-fold difference, just depending on where you live. Where would you rather live if you were dying? Almost 2 decades ago, NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, recommended that every single area should provide access to a designated palliative care telephone advice line, essentially so that people at home with palliative care needs could pick up the phone at any time, day or night, and get straight through to someone who could help them. Our research found that 2 decades after that recommendation, that national recommendation was made, just 1 in 3 areas consistently do so. 1 in 3. Let's just consider for a second that we weren't talking about palliative care. Let's consider that we were talking about a new treatment for metastatic breast cancer. Can you imagine the outrage, the uproar, if 2 decades after there was a national recommendation that a certain treatment should be available for women with breast cancer, it was only available to 1 in 3? But this is palliative care, so we just put up with it and carry on. A national audit last year found that just 60% of hospitals provided access to 7-day face-to-face palliative care, even though that has been a national recommendation for more than a decade. And we know that still 70% of hospice funding comes from charitable donations. I've lost track of the number of hospices that have needed to close beds in recent years because of a lack of money. Would we accept this situation in any other aspect of medicine? I'm sorry, there's no midwife available to deliver your baby today because we haven't had enough fun runs. I'm afraid you can't have your dialysis today because not enough second-hand clothing has been donated. Just because palliative care isn't necessarily high-tech, it doesn't mean that it can therefore be low priority. As part of the research that Angela mentioned, funded by Marie Curie, we've been gathering evidence of end-of-life experiences across England and Wales, and this is what one bereaved carer told us. The overall experience is that no one really cares. No one really cares. Cicely Saunders said, "You matter because you are you. You matter to the last moment of your life, and we will do all we can to help you not only to die peacefully, but also to live until you die. Palliative care is a high-value intervention. It's better for patients and carers, and it's better for society. Palliative care enables people to live well until they die, and die at peace and, yes, with dignity. But gaps and variation in services, underfunding, and lack of prioritization mean we end up wasting the time of people who simply don't have enough left of it. Where's the outrage?" Harvey Chochinov, a Canadian physician, has written, "The dead are not here to speak. The dying are too weak to speak. And the bereaved are too overcome by their grief to speak. If we don't speak for them, who will? So, here, metaphorically, I stand. And my question is, will you?" Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katherine, for what was an incredible introduction to palliative care, and also a really beautiful outlining of that vision of Cicely Saunders. Thank you for highlighting that palliative care is an issue of social justice, and those words which you mentioned near the end will really stay with me. You matter to the last moment of your life. You matter to the last moment of your life. There is something so radical about those words, and something powerful too in speaking up for dead, dying, and bereaved people, human beings, who do not themselves have a voice. And before I introduce our second speaker, let's take just a few moments now to reflect together in stillness on the words that we've heard. We move now to our second speaker. Dr. Rachel Clarke is an NHS palliative care doctor and writer. She is the author of 3 Sunday Times best-selling non-fiction books. Breathtaking, published in January 2021, reveals what life was really like working on NHS COVID-19 wards during the first wave of the pandemic. Dear Life, shortlisted for the 2020 Costa Biography Award and longlisted for the 2020 Baillie Gifford Prize, chosen as a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week, is based on her work in a hospice. It explores love, loss, grief, dying, and what really matters at the end of life. The third book, Your Life in My Hands, published in 2017, documents life as a junior doctor on the NHS front line. Before going to medical school, Rachel was a broadcast journalist. She produced and directed current affairs documentaries, primarily for Channel 4, focusing on subjects such as Al-Qaeda, the Iraq War, and the civil war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Rachel is also, as we will hear tonight, a co-founder and a trustee of Hospice Ukraine. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rachel Clarke.
Hi everyone, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me here this evening. What a wonderful speech, Katherine, just exceptionally brilliant. It really framed the passion with which so many of us who work in palliative medicine treat our specialty, and it struck a great chord because some of what Katherine just described was very much my experience when I started life as a medical student and then a very junior doctor. It was horribly clear to me from those very early days that many people who were approaching the end of their life in busy NHS hospitals were being neglected, essentially. Their needs were not being met. They were shut behind closed doors. The NHS was supposedly cradle to grave, and yet many of my medical contemporaries really didn't seem terribly interested in the palliative patients. And all of that was crystallized for me in a comment that one doctor made when I was a student, sort of trailing around like a little goose after him on a ward round. We went to see a patient who had come into hospital, had a new diagnosis of a widely metastatic cancer. It was clearly incurable. And the surgeon, as he left the bedside, he spent about 2 minutes there, he turned to the group of us and he simply said, "There's nothing more for me to do here, send them to the palliative dustbin." And I wish those sentiments did not exist in the NHS. That's a number of years ago now, but I fear perhaps, albeit unspoken, maybe they still do. It's certainly part of why I chose to specialize in palliative medicine. I want to be a doctor who works with patients who are particularly vulnerable, and my goodness me, palliative patients are that group by and large. The resources aren't there, the funding isn't there, they are frail, sometimes they literally cannot advocate for themselves because they're too weak or too injured by their illness. And so a doctor in society is a pretty powerful person. You know, we have a voice, we can speak out, we can try and help patients who are vulnerable, and I believe it's a very important thing to do. I'm going to follow on from Katherine's talk by, I suppose, thinking a little bit more spiritually about this topic of death, dying, and of course, grieving. I have no doubt that the vast majority, if not everybody in this audience, has experienced bereavement and grief. Some of you may be here listening with a diagnosis of a terminal, a life-limiting condition yourself. You may be caring for someone else who is approaching the end of their life. And I suppose perhaps what unites everybody in those situations is the pain and distress of being in close proximity to death and dying. We are incredibly good at, as a species, at ignoring the fact that we are mortal. We've got much more interesting things to focus on, like getting our flat white with oat milk in the morning and not, again, sorting out the mortgage or trying to find the kid's missing trainer. You know, our lives are busy, and why dwell on the end of our lives when we have an awful lot of living to do? I hope that in this talk I may answer that question in a way that's interesting and thought-provoking. So to begin, I want to share with you all a sentence that I dearly wish could be inscribed at the top of the entrance to every single hospital and every single medical school in the country. And it's a quote from the wonderful American poet Maya Angelou, who once wrote, "People will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel." Now, that is a quote that my profession, all of the healthcare professions, I think would do well to keep in the forefront of their minds. How are we making our patients feel? And this idea that in our simple, fundamental human interactions with each other, we have a kind of superpower is what underpins where I've chosen to stand in medicine, which is right alongside people who are gravely ill or approaching the end of their lives. When I tell people that I specialise in palliative medicine, they're often a bit surprised, a bit awkward, they're not quite sure what to say, or they say something like, "Gosh, I don't know how you can do that, that must be really depressing." And I always think that's a fair comment, really. Why on earth would a doctor, someone who has been through all these years of medical school and can now do these incredible things, we can restart hearts, we can deliver babies, cure cancers, transplant organs, why would you choose to surround yourself by people who are dying? What on earth is the reward in that? And I guess the answer to that question is, well, in a sense, not much. So medicine is very hierarchical, and palliative medicine is, it's fair to say, is quite a low value. It has low standing in the hierarchy. So top of the tree is definitely the neurosurgeons. I hope there are no neurosurgeons in the audience, but I think most neurosurgeons know they're at the top of the tree. So those are the doctors who have the clout, the power, the status, the glamour. They are the rock stars of medicine. And palliative doctors, we're definitely the dowdy support act. You know, we sort of lurk in the shadows. Sometimes even our colleagues aren't entirely sure what we get up to, and there isn't much status in being a doctor in palliative medicine. However, I don't find my job depressing, quite the opposite. I am one of those sickening people who absolutely loves going to work every Monday morning. And what really strikes me about working in palliative medicine is not the proximity to dying. In fact, it's the abundance of living, of life. All the best bits of life are there. Things like courage and kindness and compassion and love, they're all there in palliative medicine, but even more so, more vividly and more powerfully, more intensely, because nothing concentrates the mind quite like knowing that time is running out. I find palliative medicine to be simply the most fulfilling and inspiring job I could ever imagine doing. And to try and illustrate why, I want to introduce a particular patient to you all. Sadly, we don't have a screen. I would have loved to have shown you his face. So, Mr. John Carberry, and I'm telling his story with his permission, was 93 years old when I met him. He was transferred from my hospital in Oxford to the hospice, very close to the end of life. People weren't sure he would even survive the night. And I met him on my ward round the next morning. He had been diagnosed at the age of 92 with a cancer of his larynx, his throat. and he had been fitted with a tracheostomy. So he had a little plastic tube in his throat through which he breathed, and a speaking valve. And when the speaking valve was in, he was able to speak. He was pretty remarkable for 93 years old. He didn't get a taxi up the steep hill to the hospital in Oxford, in East Oxford, for his oncology appointments. He cycled with his tracheostomy at the age of 93. And as I was looking through his notes that morning in the hospice, I came across a wonderful letter from his oncology consultant, and it started out by saying, Mr. Carberry was here again. He really is a remarkable chap, because today, as he was cycling up the hill, he was blown off his bike by the wind. He simply brushed himself down and carried on. So John had started to hemorrhage from his tumour. So when he came to the hospice, he was very unwell. The bleeding had stopped, and being a centre of excellence for palliative care, the nurses offered him an incredibly important drug. They offered him alcohol. We have a wonderful drinks trolley, and they asked him what he would like, and he said he wanted a whiskey. I said, great. Unfortunately, he then started bleeding again. So he never got his whiskey, and he hemorrhaged through much of the life. In fact, when I arrived in the morning, I could see a priest waiting outside his door, and for a moment I thought he may have already died. He hadn't. I went into the room to meet him, expecting to meet somebody who would be very obviously very close to the end of their life. But instead, John was sitting bolt upright in his bed, looking extremely angry. His speaking valve was out, so he couldn't speak. So in lieu of that, he was gesticulating furiously, and I couldn't understand what the problem was. I was amazed he had so much energy. I eventually worked out he needed a pen and paper to write something down, and he started writing furiously. And I sort of stood there thinking, well, this is really lovely. Maybe he's writing a beautiful letter to his next of kin, his loved ones. He's writing something gorgeous, and this is going to be such a privilege to read. And I looked at what he'd written in capital letters to convey the fact that he was shouting this message at me, you know, a bit like Donald Trump used to tweet in all capitals. And what he'd written was, "Where the hell is my bloody whiskey?" So I apologize profusely for the small matter of the sort of hemorrhage stopping activities getting in the way of him and his evening whiskey, but I offered him something there and then, and it turned out his favorite drink was pink gin and lemonade. And so from that day onwards, every lunchtime he had pink gin and lemonade, not in a plastic cup, but in a proper glass beaker. We have standards in the hospice. And he was delightful. He didn't die. He stayed with us for a couple of months. Then he moved to an old a care home, and he died about 6 months later. But I used to chat to John and talk to him about his philosophy of life. I figured I had a lot to learn from him. And he summed up his philosophy of life in 2 words, which I think is the most succinct life philosophy I've ever heard. It was very simple. It was 2 words: transmit love. He said, that's all that matters, transmit love. And I thought about that a lot. I thought that's a very apt and also very poignant life philosophy to hear from a 93-year-old who has a condition of terminal cancer, who is telling me this in a hospice, because hospices, as Katherine has already mentioned, are places of living, not dying. And we work very, very hard indeed in palliative medicine to transmit love. We try to do that in every conceivable way, through the medium of pink gin or whiskey or date nights or movie nights with pizza and a patient's kids, or pets of every description. The biggest, not pet, but animal I've ever been involved with getting into a hospice, just the gardens, not the rooms itself, was a very large prize-winning bull for a patient who was a farmer, and when we asked his wife what would really mean something to him, she said, well, he loves his bull more than he's ever loved me, so you better bring that in. So we did. Broke a few rules in the John Radcliffe, but details. These acts are, of course, all about the simple, small pleasures of life that all of us love. People who are dying are not different to people who are living. You are simultaneously living while you are dying, and all of the things that we love and cherish, sunshine, birdsong, the hug and embrace of your child or your parent, all of those things mean as much, if not more, to someone approaching the end of their life as they do to us. They are what makes life worth living. So providing that, trying to help a patient experience those beautiful, tiny, simple pleasures is part of what we do. But the other aspect of those small life-affirming acts and their provision is more symbolic. They are a way of us communicating something incredibly important to a patient, which is, you are not the diseased liver in bed 4. You are not the cancer in bed 6. You are a person and you matter, and we care about you, and we are here to help and support you live as richly as you can, no matter how long or how short your remaining lifespan is, and that's incredibly important. None of this is to pretend that dying is easy for the people who are being bereaved and for the person who is dying themselves. I'm not the kind of doctor who ever tries to sugarcoat things. I think it's really important to show our patients the respect of being honest with them. But I have found in my years as a palliative care doctor that there are two aspects to the suffering that accompanies the end of life. There is the necessary suffering and the unnecessary suffering. The unnecessary suffering is the burden of symptoms, things like pain, breathlessness, nausea, vomiting. And these days, we are pretty good in palliative medicine at looking after all of those. Even in a hospice, where patients with the most complex symptoms will come to stay, it's pretty rare to have a patient with terrible intractable pain, for example. And one thing I like to say to all my patients is, the right dose of medications is the dose you need for your symptoms to be controlled. There is no upper limit. There's not a figure where suddenly we're going to say, sorry, if your pain gets worse, you won't get any more morphine. The right dose is what you need, and we can give anything you need to be comfortable, and that's really important to know. But the necessary kind of suffering is a different matter. It's an existential form of anguish, I think, and that is, it's an anguish that no amount of drugs can palliate. It's the knowledge when you are dying that every single person, every single thing that you love in this beautiful world of ours is slipping through your fingers, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. It doesn't matter how much you love your son, your daughter, the world around you, it is slipping through your fingers. And that, of course, is our terrible, beautiful shared fate of being mortal creatures. We know from really the moment we are conscious that we are destined to die. We will lose everyone we love one way or another. And for that kind of anguish, I would suggest the philosophy of John Carberry, aged 93 years old, is pretty much spot on. The thing that really helps, from my perspective, where I stand in palliative medicine, is human connection. How we transmit care and love to each other, that is the vital medicine. It is other people who make the difference. There is a beautiful book about precisely this, written by the singer Nick Cave, The book is called Faith, Hope and Carnage. It's wonderful. I'm not recommending my books, I'm recommending someone else's. Beautiful book, and it was written in large part as a response to the death of his son, Arthur, aged 15 years old, in a tragic accident, the most unimaginable grief. And Nick described that grief in the following words, and this may resonate with some of you. He wrote, "Grief was pounding through my body with an audible roar, and despair was bursting through the tips of my fingers. We tend to see grief as an emotional state, but it is also an atrocious, destabilizing assault upon the body, so much so that it can feel terminal." What helped Nick in that unimaginable anguish was tiny acts of kindness from other people. He described going into a cafe in Brighton where he lives, and the death of his son had been in the newspapers. It was a publicly known fact. The woman behind the counter in the cafe didn't say anything to him, but when he went to hand over his money for whatever he was buying, she simply squeezed his hand, and in that moment, that squeeze of his hand, she looked him in the eye, and he knew that she was saying to him, "I'm so sorry. I am so sorry you lost your 15-year-old son." And it meant an enormous amount to him. The other thing that mattered to him, that helped him, was the realization that in this terrible plight of being mortal, of knowing that the more we love people, the more we stand to lose, none of us is alone. That is our shared human fate. And again, a beautiful quote from Nick on this. "We are each of us imperiled insofar as anything can turn catastrophic at any time, personally, for each of us. We are all, at some point in our lives, obliterated by loss. If you haven't been now, you will be in time, that's for sure." This realization for Nick Cave also inspired a kind of wonder, because he realized that despite that fact, despite the obliteration by loss that we all face at some stage, the human animal keeps on loving. We keep on loving each other, don't we? We keep taking risks with our hearts, and we lay them right open in our love for each other, even though the price of that is loss. I want to end with what for me is, I think, one of the most important things I have learned as a doctor. It is this, it's that the amount of pain in grief is commensurate with the amount of love. I mean by that it hurts as much as it should hurt. It hurts as much as you loved the person you are losing or you have lost. It is the price of loving them that much. Grief is the form that love takes when somebody dies, and actually we have two choices. We can either not love at all, and what kind of life would that be, or we can just carry on loving regardless. And I think that's the only way really to live. One final quote, and this is from Ted Hughes, who is one of my absolute favourite poets. He loved the open-heartedness of children. He thought that open-hearted embrace of the world was the way we as adults should try to live our lives. And this is what he wrote about what matters in life. "The only calibration that counts is how much heart people invest, how much they ignore their fears of being hurt or caught out or humiliated. And the only thing people regret is that they didn't live boldly enough, that they didn't invest enough heart, they didn't love enough. Nothing else really counts at all." So to conclude, where I stand in my very deliberate proximity to death is in the knowledge that in the face of these astonishingly, exquisitely, painfully mortal, fleeting lives of ours. We are all mere sparks, little flashes against light years of darkness. The thing that matters is having the courage to choose love, to keep on loving, and to throw ourselves headlong and recklessly and lovingly right into the heart of this beautiful, beautiful world of ours. And crucially, that at the end of our lives, the love of others is the most powerful drug known to medicine, way more powerful than any doses of morphine. And one final thought before I finish. Last week, some of you may have followed the extensive news coverage of the COVID inquiry. I'm not going to repeat the language of Dominic Cummings in this setting, but I do want to touch on this very briefly because one of the very shocking things that emerged last week in our national COVID inquiry was an entry in Sir Patrick Vallance's diary, the then Chief Scientific Officer, and he recorded the then Prime Minister describing COVID as nature's way of dealing with old people. I simply want to say this in response to that. In the NHS, there are so many people like me who find that sentiment absolutely abhorrent, repellent. There are doctors and nurses and all manner of healthcare professionals like me who know that it doesn't matter how old a patient is, or how disabled a patient is, or how short their remaining life expectancy is, because everybody is a human being and everybody's life has value, and it matters all the way to the end, to the last weeks, days, hours, moments. And in response to that idea that somehow any illness was a way of dealing with the problem of a group in society, I want to say no, absolutely not. Every human being matters in our society. Every human being deserves dignity and comfort and love at the end of their lives, and the NHS is filled with people who will do their utmost to provide it for all of you. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you for taking us on that exploration of the spiritual dimension of caring for people at the end of their lives. I don't think I will ever forget that story of John. And it reminded me that actually hospitals are places of great humor as well. They're places of stories and meaning making, but they're also places where of lightheartedness. They're places of fun. They can be places of entertainment. And yeah, the pink gin and lemonade is such a wonderful kind of evocative reminder of that for me. I think we all have a lot to learn from John and the wisdom of so many others like him. And so before we hear from our third speaker for tonight, let's just once again take a few moments to reflect together in stillness on what we've heard. I'll now introduce our third and final speaker for this evening. Amber Jeffrey is a celebrated podcast host, online community facilitator, grief mentor, and consultant. Her work and her podcast, The Grief Gang, specializes in breaking down the topic that is grief, one conversation at a time. By sharing her own experiences of loss, as well as the stories of others on both her show and online platforms. Through her dedicated and passionate voice, she has gone on to deliver talks and panel discussions at the University of Cambridge, Westminster for the UK Commission on Bereavement, and as of recently, consultancy work for the University of Oxford. She's on a mission to get the country and further afield comfortable with talking about death, dying, and grief. And her slogan to the podcast reads, "Welcome to the gang, the one you never asked to be part of." Please join me in welcoming Amber Jeffrey.
Hello everybody, it's really lovely to be here with you all tonight, and thank you both to Katherine and Rachel for such wonderful speeches, and forgive my snotty nose. I often find that when I'm in these sort of speaking events and these gigs to kind of say everything that I'm not more than everything that I am. And so for everything that I'm not an academic, I'm not a doctor, but what I am is an experienced expert. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I became an experienced expert, and actually really how probably many of you in the crowd today are experienced experts in your own rights and just need a little bit of help finding that. So my work kind of comes into after your guys' wonderful work has taken place and given people the right care at the end of their life, and I come in to support the families and the loved ones who are left with these incomprehensible losses. But it wasn't a line of work that I sort of just woke up one day and thought, yeah, I'll spend my 20s working in grief. Well, you know what 20-year-old does. Mine is a personal experience and still continues to this day. And so my story with my work trails all the way back to 2016. On the 25th of June, to be specific. With me being 19 at the time, my mother suffered a very sudden heart attack and died. And as you can imagine, for any child at that time, I think no real age you're ready to lose a parent or a really significant person in your life. But at the age of 90, in a really impressionable age, of course, rocked my world to its very, very core. And being so young and exposed to the real hardships of life, I was thrusted into this world of trying to navigate a world without the person who had brought me into it. And what those 3 years after my mother died entailed of was just keeping my head down and keeping calm and carrying on. Back then, it kind of felt there wasn't really many resources for specifically young people or quite really grieving people to turn to, quite accessible as well. And so for those 3 years, I kind of just got my head down and kept going until, as always with grief, as much as you try to do that, grief will always find a way to come out and say hello. When you don't expect it, when you don't want it, when you haven't organised it into your schedule, grief will say, hello, you and me, we need to talk. And that's exactly what it did in the summer of 2019. It reared its big, big, ugly head, and I didn't really like it so much then. And it said, we need to sort some stuff out here. And I said, okay, let's do the dance then. Here we go. And it wasn't as eloquent as that. We really tussled with each other. And what eventually this birthed was this frustration of looking around and looking amongst my peers in my community and society and saying, we're really bad at this stuff, aren't we? We're really bad at talking about grief. And how can we change that? And I, perhaps like many of you, really enjoy podcasts, and I feel like they're a really great pastime. They can take you, just like books, into a different world and tell you all sorts of stories. And so in an airport, waiting to go on a holiday to kind of escape the grief, as I very much did that, just kind of flew the country and try and get away with it, but grief travels, funnily enough. And I thought, let me see if there's any grief podcasts out there, if there's any people doing this work. And I just popped in grief into the search bar, and a good handful of them came up, and I thought, amazing, this is great. And I had a listen, and I thought, okay, this is good, but something just wasn't quite speaking to me. And so on this holiday with me and my partner, my mind is ticking away, listening and absorbing all these incredible podcasts and these stories, but something was still missing. So I sat there after, and I look back now, and it probably might have been a little bit of delirium because I had quite a bad bout of bellyache, and something didn't agree with me on the holiday, so it was quite delirium or eureka moment. But I thought, sod it, I'll do the podcast myself. If I can't find that voice, then I will try and be that voice and try and tell my story, which maybe in turn might tell the story of many others. And so we came back from this holiday, and I hit the ground running with, at that point then, 3 years of pent-up grief and thoughts and feelings that I needed to share and get off my chest. And that's exactly what I did. I started the Grief Gang, and with its name, as we said, with the slogan, welcome to the gang, the one you never want to be part of, because you don't want to be, but when you have somebody die in your life, you are honoured and given this lifetime membership of a gang that you kind of think, this is really rubbish, but you're in really good company. You're in company with others who have maybe just embarked on this journey like you, people who have had their membership for 10 plus years, 20 plus years. There is always somebody who is part of the gang. And so as I started the podcast and I started to share these 3 years worth of grief and stories and feelings, I very much realised very quickly that for my own healing and understanding, I knew there would be great learnings and healing in hearing other people's stories too. That I know that I am not alone in this, and that I need to share and do my work as my act of service to share the stories and walks of loss that many have walked. And so I set on my journey to find plenty more people who so bravely and courageously would share their story with me on the podcast. And that was the end of 2019 into 2020. And as we approached the global pandemic, the way and the shift in how we spoke about grief, the distinct difference I saw between pre-pandemic and entering the pandemic of how we spoke about grief and how we approached it. Before the pandemic, when I was speaking with people and connecting with people online, it really did feel like we were confined to this sort of dirty corner of the internet where we kind of hush into the corner, we'll talk about this here, but don't take it out into your everyday. And then we're faced with a pandemic where every single day we are seeing people die, and we're seeing mass graves, we are seeing people who are being stripped of their rituals of when their loved ones die, people having funerals with no more than 10 people, not being able to lean on their fellow friends and their community to help them through this time of their life. And so what does that do to people when they're stripped of their rituals? It makes them angry. It makes them feel lonely. They feel completely alone because we have been both physically pushed away from each other. And I think the biggest learning I found, and still do to this day with my work, and when people ask, what's the formula with grief? We have the 5 stages of grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that is actually not intended for the bereaved, but for the dying. But so often, as bereaved people, we are kind of looking for those 5 stages. We're looking for just something, a Bible, a blueprint to say, do X, Y, and Z, and you'll be okay. And I'm sometimes the bad messenger, and I say, there's none. But the biggest thing that I find time and time again that saves people's lives is community. Finding belonging and finding one another is time and time again the thing that I've seen that has come out on top. If we're to look back in history and look at devastating tragedies across the globe, more times than most, what you'll see is community, and radical community. With 9/11, Grenfell, even through bouts of the pandemic, we all come together at times of loss and tragedy to support one another. But sometimes along the line we kind of lose that. We lose that sense of community, and we can't fall back into the individualistic mindset. But time and time again we will always call upon our communities. And it can be really hard to find your community, and especially when you're grieving and you might not know where to look for. And that's where the work sort of that I do comes into play. I've spent majority of my 20s, and I found it really interesting when, Rachel, you said about your work. People say, is that not really depressing? Is that really not morbid? And I say, it is the most life-changing work I've ever done with my life. And if someone said, would you rewrite it all again and not do it? I say, absolutely not. Because I have found things about myself and my grief that I don't think I would ever have discovered had I not done this work, and found community and solace in other people's stories. And so I suppose to close, I really want to emphasise for people who are in the crowd today who might be bereaved, and especially as we approach the festive period, which can be quite a particular tough time for us, is to keep telling your story. Storytelling is a huge part of grief. We can often feel as time goes by and the time between when our person and our people die, that their stories are dying with them. And that as long as we sort of continue to share their names, their stories, our grief, all aspects of it, we are participating in the active role to heal ourselves and to support ourselves. There's often the misconception of that if we're talking about our grief, we're actually kind of going back in time, and it's completely the opposite, I find. The more we can talk about it and find the language to support ourselves and others, the more we are breaking down the taboo about talking about grief, because we're all going to die, and everyone that we love is going to die, sadly. Sorry, don't shoot the messenger. But the sooner we get equipped with it, the better, because in grief, it can be incredibly lonely. But to me, I don't think you have to be lonely alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amber, for that experience that you bring, for the lived experience. Thank you for highlighting the importance of belonging and community, of telling your story, and of having the courage to keep telling it. Thank you for highlighting that importance of not trying to grieve alone, but of valuing the company and the support of having people around you. There is so much wisdom in what you've shared, and in the experience that you and so many in this room bring to this conversation. And so before we have a time for questions, let's take another few moments to reflect on the wisdom that Amber has shared with us tonight. So we will now have our time of questions. We've got about 20 minutes for questions. If you're on site in our building, please do come forward to the central microphone, and a reminder to keep your questions brief. One succinct sentence is ideal. And if you're online, please do email your questions, as mentioned earlier, to jolly.gosnold@smitf.org. And that email address should appear on your screen. I'm going to invite our three speakers tonight to come forward to the microphones.
We have a question from online, from Michael, who asks, well, he says, thank you for talking about death and dying. We're told that many people with long-term degenerative diseases, like me, with slow MND, should be allowed to end their lives in order to save themselves from suffering. Is there an alternative? What do you think?
Thank you, Jolly.
Hello, nice to hear from all of you, and so good to hear that it's found so inspiring to be at the end of life. You said what it is to die, what it is to live, and I found the same, that the people who are dying are so lively. I'm so interested to find out, do you find that you can talk about salvation, the salvation story of Jesus, to people who are passing away, to give them the prospect of eternal life?
Thank you. And we'll have one more, please.
Thank you. What you've actually described is actually a postcode lottery. And how can we change that? How do we approach our local health authority to get something done about this?
Thank you very much. So we've got assisted dying, eternal life, and a postcode lottery. I'm going to leave all of those open to all of our speakers. So if anyone has anything to comment on any of those, please feel free.
Shall I start on the postcode lottery? Yeah, there is a postcode lottery, and it will affect everyone in this room, and you might be lucky, and you might be lucky because you're white and middle class, but it's not right. Now, there are many ways to try and improve that situation. As an academic, I'm trying to improve it through my research, but every single person in this room has the ability to make a difference there. Make a noise. Demonstrate outrage, because it is an outrageous situation that hospices are funded through second-hand clothing sales. It's an outrageous situation that not everyone who needs palliative care can get it. And it is an abhorrent situation that there are differences in terms of who gets palliative care according to the colour of people's skin. Make a noise, write to your MP. That's what I think everyone can do.
Thank you.
Shall I tackle assisted dying? I think the question was, is there an alternative? So if someone has a sort of degenerative disease which can have a big symptom burden like motor neurone disease, they may think that assisted dying is the only option. Is there an alternative? And I think this is a really, really difficult and emotive topic, and the argument that it should be up to an individual to decide when they end their own life and the manner in which they end their own life is, in one sense, very, very compelling. It's very difficult to argue with that, and I occasionally meet a patient who perhaps is in their last, 2-3 days of life, and they're absolutely exhausted, and they will say, I wish I could just, finish things now. I'm so exhausted. And I suppose there are a couple of important kind of counter-arguments. So one is concern around vulnerable groups. Katherine has already very eloquently articulated the postcode lottery in palliative care and the fact that we estimate at least 100,000 people a year are dying in the UK who should be receiving palliative care and are not because the resources aren't there. I am really troubled by the idea that some people may seek assisted dying, may want assisted dying, because they are not receiving the high quality care they should, nothing like it. And we will occasionally hear these cases in the newspaper of individuals who have taken their own life And perhaps they've had no support, social, medical, palliative support, and that has created a burden of suffering, which in the vocabulary that I used earlier was not necessary, it was avoidable, but they didn't get the care they needed. We know in Canada at the moment, where assisted dying is legalised, there is growing concern on the part of the medical profession around the numbers of people who are being proactively offered and even pushed the option of medically assisted dying, arguably because it is cheaper than providing a patient with a chronic illness with the care and support that they need. And I think above all in palliative medicine, what I see and what I work with is a patient population who are very, very vulnerable and are very overlooked within a hospital setting, within society, politically, and every level. Palliative care patients don't have a big voice. They're not sexy. They don't rate highly in the sort of currency that counts these days in modern Britain, which is how loud your voice is. And I couldn't bear the idea of people choosing to end their lives because the simple, relatively cheap palliative care was not in place for them. I'm not sure if that's exactly an answer to the question, but I hope it was helpful.
Definitely. Thank you, Rachel. Amber, would you like to respond to any of those?
Can you remind me the question?
So we have something around is there an alternative in the form of assisted dying?
Yeah.
There's a question around the postcode lottery in terms of receiving palliative care. And then also there was a question kind of from a Christian perspective around like eternal life. And I hope I'm paraphrasing this one correctly, but something around can eternal life bring hope to people who are facing the end of their life? I hope that's a fair summary of that question.
I think I definitely agree with you, Katherine, on the postcode lottery of that. It can be so frustrating when you're looking, and it is, I'm going to speak from the bereavement support sector of that. Yeah, there are with certain charities and organisations where some of their support and their funding is really rife in some areas, and some it's absolutely dire. And you think, why, just because I don't live in that postcode, do I not get the support? And sometimes it is, we do have to be, it's frustrating that we have to get such to a place of desperation where we have to take things into our own hands. And if you have the capabilities and the resources in your community, build your community and do something together. Specifically, I know many of sort of death cafes that have been put together by local communities in their village hall, and just that small little group can create such a huge impact. So I agree with you there, Katherine. And I suppose to touch on what we were talking there about with faith, from a lot of people that I've worked with, the family members and loved ones of those who have died, and the person who has died has had a particular, resonance with their faith. For the family members left behind who are grieving, there it can be great peace, and they've had conversations with their loved one who is dying, and perhaps for that loved one who really believes in their faith that there may be an afterlife, and they are moving on to be reunited with other loved ones. For the family who are left here, that can bring them great peace, knowing that their loved one believes that and feels that, and that they can travel on their journey wherever they're going, and that we here and them who are left here know sort of they're in good hands wherever they've gone, that they felt that they have gone. So I see a lot in my work, a lot of people leaning towards their faith and taking quite a lot of comfort, and leaning into its complexities as well, but quite a lot of comfort too, I find.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And like when I was, my best friend actually has a really good story around this. She worked in palliative care as a junior doctor, and there was a patient who was dying, and their family weren't able to get to them, and it brought great comfort that one of the nurses on the ward was able to say the Lord's Prayer with her in Irish. And it's astonishing how those kinds of like something as simple as that brought her so much peace. And I think as well, just on the image of eternal life and from a Christian perspective, I guess I'd like to say briefly that image of resurrection and eternal life is, of course, so important. But something which I've often found comforting as well is the idea that in the Christian story, God is prepared to die and to go through that process of dying. And in some ways, God in Jesus knows what it is to go through that process something which Rachel mentioned, of your life slipping away almost, and your experience of the world, and that kind of closeness of God to the process of dying and of death is something which also is something that brings me comfort too. Jolly, do you have one more, or should we go straight? Thank you.
We've got a couple more.
Yep.
So one is about grief here, saying, can grieving too much ever be bad for you? And another one about palliative care. With a terminal diagnosis and a short window of remaining time, a patient might become angry. They can be the nicest, most religious person you know, but they're angry as their life begins to slip away and they haven't yet moved towards acceptance. Do you have any suggestions or tools for families and friends that they can use to deal with a terminal patient's anger?
Thank you.
You've talked very eloquently about your experiences of your own bereavement and your testimony and advocacy for those who are dying. I wondered if you could share with us how those experiences and expertise have shaped or reshaped your approach to your own death.
Can you grieve too much? How can you best manage someone's anger? And how does all this affect your relationship to your own death?
I'll take the first one with the grief of reading too much. I do think, yes, to a degree, you can, especially now where there are so many books on grief and supporting yourself. And I think, as we know with books, it can transcend you to different worlds and different stories. I say you can't read your way out of grief, that's for one. But I think there's different times when different books and different stories will do different things for you. I've met plenty of people who are in the very immediacy of their grief and they are grabbing every single grief book off the shelf. And I go, could you tell me what the last page was about? And they go, no. And I go, no, because your brain isn't cognitively working. So sort of for me and with my grief, I know years later that these books were able to speak to me and to support me at different periods of my life. So perhaps I'd say, I don't think you can read too much, but I think to be potentially a bit conscious of when you're reading, especially if there are books, these are books on other people's stories and traumas. Sometimes in the moment it might feel quite beneficial, but then sometimes reading on paper, especially stories that may be quite similar to yours or experiences that are, can sometimes do a bit more damage than it can do good. So just being cautious of when you're reading and what you're reading, I'd say.
Thank you. Rachel is going to take anger.
Yes, because I want to recommend another person's book for this. There is an incredible book written by the American comedian Rob Delaney, which is, oh my God, what's it called? A Heart That Works, thank you. A Heart That Works. It's about the death of his baby boy from a brain tumour. So, you know, the most unimaginable kind of bereavement. And one of the things that is magnificent about this book is the sheer force with which he lets rip his rage at this obscene, unthinkable event. How can a baby have a brain tumour and die of a brain tumour? And it's absolutely magnificent. So my short answer to your question is encourage it. Encourage your friend, your relative to express all of their anger towards this terminal diagnosis. It isn't fair. Why should it be you, not someone else? You know, we get angry if someone cuts us up on the M40. We're allowed to be angry if we get struck down by a diagnosis of terminal anger. And I think in general, with extreme emotions, most people find it hard and uncomfortable to sit with someone else who is expressing extreme emotion, whether it's anger, rage, distress, anguish. So perhaps one of the best things you can do, even if you're feeling uncomfortable with that intensity of emotion, is to sit with it. And just to share Rob Delaney's anger very briefly, he tells this wonderful story in a book about how a friend of his says to him, "Oh, I really understand what you're going through, Rob, because, my granddad, we thought he was going to die from cancer, but then he didn't, he survived." And Rob Delaney is incandescent. How dare this person compare the almost death of a granddad with the death of his baby? And he writes in the book, I won't repeat all the swear words, but he says in the book, what on earth was this person thinking of? Grandparents are meant to die. Grandparents are the practice deaths. They're one up from the deaths of pets. They're the deaths that prepare you for the really difficult deaths. Now, forgive me if that's insensitive with the age of one or two members of the people in this congregation, but I just thought it was a wonderful example of real, raw, visceral anger, and it's in somebody, it needs to be expressed, so sit with it if you can.
Thank you, Rachel.
So I think it's down to me to take what I think is the hardest question, which is how has this work in palliative medicine influenced how I am approaching my own death? It's a really hard question because it's terribly exposing, because the answer is probably not enough, actually, if I think about it. I'm an academic, foremost, and my approach to all things medically related is to look for the evidence, and that is what I will do when faced with a terminal illness. I will look at the evidence, and as I said earlier, I'll repeat it again, the evidence is that palliative care works. So I will be pushing for palliative care, not after the doctors have said the palliative dustbin or whatever that awful phrase was, but early on, because I know that the evidence says that palliative care works best when it's provided early, collaboratively, as an extra layer of support. Most palliative care teams will allow you to self-refer or to refer a relative. You don't even have to go through a doctor. The other thing that I would make sure is that if I had a terminal illness and I was deteriorated, that I had a do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation form on my chart, because I do not want someone jumping up and down and breaking my ribs when I'm dying. I want my children and family around me holding my hands and singing sweetly to me, not a team of medics trying to start a heart that won't start.
And are we allowed to very quickly, because there are 400 of you, including the online people, opportunity to say advanced care planning. If you haven't had this conversation with a member of your family yet, just have it. It takes a second. Just ask the people you love. Tell me what you would want me to know in the event that you had some catastrophic accident. We were called at 3 a.m. from the hospital to say they're in a coma. Would they want intensive care? Have that conversation. It's not going to upset people. It's an act of kindness to tell your loved ones your wishes and to ask them proactively about their wishes. It's an act of kindness because it means everyone's prepared and you have the best chance of advocating on behalf of your relative to ensure that if the end of their life is occurring in hospital, it's on their own terms. It's how they want it to be. So make a cup of tea, please, and spend 2 minutes having that conversation. It's worth it.
Thank you, Rachel. So we'll take one more from Jolly and then the gentleman behind as well.
Thank you. One more from online. The person says, a close relative of mine has nursed his wife for over 5 years. She is in and out of consciousness and more comatose than awake. He is now beginning to suffer depression. What action can I take to support him?
Thank you for your comments on euthanasia, which I very much resonate with. I feel in the West we're very individualistic, and we come at this issue from that point of view. There is an argument I've heard that if we cut life short, it denies a journey both for the individual, let alone the community of family and friends around. My question is, I wonder how Indigenous populations deal with end of life. And I'd love to hear that, because there's wisdom and spirituality in Indigenous lives around the world. We're talking about it from a Western point of view here. I'd love the views of the wider global view.
Thank you very much. And we'll take yours as well.
This is a question for Katherine. Katherine, it sounds to me as if you're calling for all of us here to stand with people who need palliative care, and it sounds like it's a health social movement for palliative care. But I don't know the organisations, which organisations should I be looking to equip me with, writing to my MP or to doing the things that would promote the change that's needed. So perhaps you could answer that.
Thank you. So we have support for carers and those looking after people who are dying, Indigenous communities and how they kind of deal with dying and death, and then organisations and charities. And I think there was one other, but it has sadly escaped me. But it may not have escaped one of you. So, but with that, I will leave you, or Amber, I think you might want to respond to the Indigenous...
Yeah, I'll go, I mean, I don't know in depth within Indigenous groups, but I know from definitely in Western culture, we can take a leaf out of other communities and how they approach death and dying. I do often sort of think and I wonder if I was to sit down with people from these groups and say, oh, this is like the work that I'm doing, they go, that's far too much, like just incorporate it into your everyday life. And I'll be like, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do, because it's just so innately within their culture and in their everyday. We look in sort of, Dia de los Muertos and the Day of the Dead, and how what a beautiful celebration of life and afterlife that is, and that we could definitely take a leaf out of their books and to sort of, I wouldn't be able to speak too much into what specifically they do in Indigenous cultures, but I know definitely in our Western world we've lost our way, or if we ever had our way with it, with being quite acquainted with death and dying. And I think we did somewhere along the way, as I mentioned earlier, became quite individualistic. And so I think we'd be remiss to not sort of look across the globe and take things where we can respectfully and apply them to our lives and to our cultures. But yeah, I think we've got quite a long way to go, perhaps, in catching up with these cultures. But there is work to be done, and we can do it.
Thank you.
I'll just add something to that. I mean, I completely agree with you, but the flip side of it, from the evidence point of view, is almost all of the evidence we have on death, dying and bereavement in this country that we generate is from white people. I just said that we just did this study of experiences of death, dying and bereavement across England and Wales. We've had very, very few responses, actually, from people who are not white, and that's a massive, massive gap in our understanding. So as academics, we need to be going forward and seeking out those additional views and perspectives so that we don't just design services that suit people who fill out our surveys or respond to our calls for research, that we design services that suit everyone in society. In terms of what you can do, it's a really good question. So I do think that writing to your MP is a really good first step, because I can try and make a lot of noise from the perspective of evidence, but actually, and a policymaker could ignore me, but if an MP receives 100 letters on their doorstep that say, what are you doing to ensure fair access to palliative care, they won't ignore that. So even just saying, did you know that over 100,000 people die each year needing palliative care but not receiving it in this country? What are the figures for our local area and how are you improving that? I think would be really effective. There are also several really good charities that have campaigns, charities like Hospice UK, Marie Curie Macmillan. I'll also make a plug for Cicely Saunders International, which is a charity particularly focused on evidence in palliative and end-of-life care.
Thank you, Catherine. And finally, Rachel.
Yeah, so the question about the person who's been caring for their wife or partner, I think, for some 5 years, that is such an incredibly hard and lonely job. Anybody, I have no doubt there are people in this room who have, and indeed are, carers for family members. It is so tough trying to care for someone you love at home. The resources are not there, or they're hard to access. It is lonely, it is relentless, it is exhausting. Often people don't really want to know about it. So as a friend of that individual, I would just encourage you to perhaps try and give them a break, a little bit of respite, offer to take over that role for half a day, get them out, buy them tickets to the movies with a friend while you're taking the caring burden for a few hours, if that's possible. Maybe explore if that individual is plugged into all the services that are out there. Are they receiving support from a local palliative care community team? And every community has them, and they can really help signpost to other organisations that can help. But it is a very difficult and grueling and exhausting role, and allowing your friend the opportunity to kind of offload about that can be really helpful. Listen, care about it, and try, if you can, maybe to just give them a bit of a break regularly, a few hours where they can relax.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This brings us to the end of our time for the lecture this evening. I cannot thank the three of our speakers enough. I feel like you've all brought wonderfully complementary perspectives. You've really showed us how each one of you takes a stand on this issue, and I am absolutely sure that you have inspired us all in this building and online to consider the importance of good palliative care, of good dying in our own lives and in the lives of so many others. So without further ado, let's all show our appreciation for all of our speakers tonight. So, as I mentioned, we've now got a reception in the crypt, and there's step-free access to our crypt next door if you need it to be, and you're all most welcome to join us for a drink and a chance to have conversation with each other and with some of our speakers, and to get your hands on some of the books from this series. Please do join us on the 20th of November for our final lecture with Amina J. Mohammed, the Deputy Director of the United Nations. We're taking a collection at the end of this lecture. So as you go out, and some of you are on the way already, please do donate if you can via cash or one of our card machines. And do complete the evaluation forms for this series. It really helps us to know what went well and what changes we could make for next year. We're always keen to get your thoughts, so do send those in to us. Thank you all, and good night. Thank you.